Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Anne Brande. She is the founder of the Albany County Conservancy, which is based in Laramie, Wyoming. Anne, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, Robert.
So, Anne, I got acquainted with the Albany County Conservancy after I published a piece on Substack about the dangers that proposed wind projects in and around your area pose to golden eagles and bald eagles. So if you don't mind, that's a brief introduction, but I don't know if you listen to this podcast, but guests introduce themselves. I've given your brief bio, but imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, you have about a minute to introduce yourself. You might want to explain why that big camera is behind you, but you have a minute. Please tell us who you are. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm a fourth generation Wyomingite. My great grandfather was Kaiser Wilhelm II's court photographer in Germany. And he went to the unveiling of the Eiffel Tower and he got hired on the spot and he went to Fifth Avenue in New York City. And he worked there for a year and he read Go West, Young Man. And so he bought a one-way train ticket, being the romantic and artist he was, and he headed west. And he fell in love with Laramie, Wyoming, after having spent the night before getting back on the train. So he came back to Laramie. He borrowed $10 from the mayor of Laramie, which back then in 1904 was a lot of money. He opened a charge account with Kodak and he started his first studio. And he had 3 daughters. The youngest was my grandmother. And he trained them all to be photographers, and that has passed through the women in my family. So I run a portrait studio, but as you might guess, in Wyoming, in Laramie in particular, I'm not inside very much. Although I have a great studio, I'm outside. Laramie is very unique. It's surrounded on all 4 sides with mountain ranges. It's part of the Rocky Mountain ecosystem. And so my family over the years, because photographers are preservers. We preserve memories. So my family became really interested in history. And my grandfather bought a homestead in Albany County, which is where I live. And I'm also in the unique position where I'm an only child. So COVID-19 gave me time to really feel guilt kicking in because I'm noticing institutional memory, the public understanding, wildlife and ecosystems and ecology and history, that's all going to the wayside. And so I decided to set up a conservancy devoted to preserving, protecting, and promoting habitat, history, and wildlife, because that's my day-to-day.
In Albany County, and I'm just looking at the map here, so Albany County is it's a big county by looks. Wyoming's a big state, but it includes Laramie, and Laramie is toward the southern part of the county. But so I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a strict 1 minute. We don't have a strict 1 minute rule, but I want to turn the conversation now, and I think that's great. And by the way, so you need to tell us about the camera. If you're listening and not watching on YouTube, to Anne's right behind her is a big, very large format camera. What's the story behind that camera? You're a photographer. Tell us about that.
Well, it's my great-grandfather's camera. And he actually would take that 8x10 camera out in the field to photograph the indigenous cultures in the Laramie Valley, to photograph cowboys, which that was not easy to do.
So you still have some of those photos that I'm assuming is a very big format camera. Okay, well, good. So let's talk about why I wanted to the issue at hand, which is I wrote this Substack a couple of days ago about the threat that proposed wind projects in southern Wyoming pose to both the bald and golden eagle, and cited the work or one of the comments by Mike Lockwood, who's a biologist, who said that these wind projects pose a profoundly dangerous, his words, they pose a profoundly dangerous threat to golden eagles. But I note that the Albany County Conservancy has filed comments, as Lockwood did, with the Bureau of Land Management on the environmental assessment for the Two Rivers Wind Project. But there are other wind projects that are now proposed for central and southeastern Wyoming. I guess briefly, and one of the first questions I have here is, Why do you oppose these wind projects? Wyoming's a very sparsely populated state. There are a lot of open spaces. Why are you so staunchly opposed to these projects?
So that's a typical attitude that Wyoming politicians have had since before Wyoming was a state. The Union Pacific needed us to be a state. And so we've always known that we can have wildlife and we can do energy development. And we're a global energy developer when you look back at our days of coal. We are coal, oil, gas. Now we're nuclear. Gates is building an atrium facility in Wyoming. And we're also wind, and we're now looking into solar. But even Wyoming, if you were to develop our energy capacity in the wind arena alone, we would exceed our borders to produce the amount of energy that we're producing currently. And it's caught up with everybody. We're also we have the lowest regulations of any of the 50 states. We're pretty much a bring business to us and we can accommodate you. So we're very ill prepared to deal with cumulative impacts. We're not used to that.
And you're speaking of cumulative impacts from from wind projects, because that seems to be I mean, if I'm reading your comments with the Bureau of Land Management are 9 pages. If I would summarize what the messaging here, you're threatening to file lawsuits against the federal government because of what you're saying they're violating the National Environmental Policy Act, potentially violating the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. But the punchline here, if I'm going to paraphrase how I'm reading this, is you're saying the federal agencies are ignoring the cumulative impact of these different wind projects. And I'm looking at if I calculate them here, you have the Two Rivers Wind Project, Rail Tie, the Chokecherry and Sierra Madre. We're talking on the order of 800 wind turbines that all would be within or near Albany County. Is that roughly the right number?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Chokecherry and Sierra Madre. Chokecherry and Sierra.
You're going to have 800 more.
So counting Albany and Carbon counties, and is Carbon adjacent to? I forgive me.
It is. And some of these wind projects you just named, right? Two Rivers, Rock Creek, sit between both counties.
And Rock Creek, so Rail Tie is being pushed by ConnectGen, which is part of a Quantum Energy out of Houston. And then Rock River is Invenergy, is that right?
Correct. Rock Creek.
Rock Creek, I'm sorry.
But it's in Rock River.
Okay. Yeah. Right. And so I forgot about the Rock Creek project. So that's another 100 or so. So we're talking 900 or 1,000 wind turbines between Albany and Carbon County that could be built. But all of this, if I'm going to I want to focus on the small picture, but the big picture as well. A lot of this depends on the construction of the Trans-West Express transmission project, right? Which is the other big unknown here, waiting for final approval from the Bureau of Land Management. Do I have this right?
So there have been power purchase agreements, and I can't even keep up with all the projects. So I'd like to slow down and explain that. Sure. When I set up the Conservancy, my number one goal was to put a migrations museum on Highway 287. That is an alternate route from northern Colorado up through the state that people take to Yellowstone National Park, among many other things. And when we look further north along that route, you have wind devastation in the Shirley Basin. But I hadn't really become educated to that. I wanted to put a museum focused on indigenous cultures passing through that migration area of the Rockies that go back to prehistory. My family has a prehistory collection that's very extensive that we found on our homestead. And then with the photographs, my family's photographic collection's the only one of a kind in the world. It's very special. And I wanted to put the two together. And it was my hope to build wings onto the museum, just like the Buffalo Bill Cody Museum, that over time would then feature the Sioux in that area. Take it to a more recent time of the Plains Indian times. And, that was treaty land that was never honored. But that's a bigger conversation because, as we all know, the sovereign nation it has a very pained relationship with the Bureau of Land Management, with our federal government because of history. So I figured that would happen naturally, even after my time on this planet. All I needed to do was build my museum to start the conversation. But I couldn't do that knowing that rail tie wind would negatively impact over 162 nationally significant historic sites. Just that one project. Wyoming is extremely rich in wildlife habitat, big game, migratory birds. We're the least populated state. We've been the haven of biodiversity for a North America that is urbanizing and building out. And we've been that haven for a long time. And that gets to Mike. The way I met Mike, I went to an Albany County Commissioner meeting, and he was brought in by a commissioner who's sympathetic, but basically has no regulations to empower them.
So just to interrupt, I'm sorry to interrupt. You're talking about Mike Lockwood, who's the biologist I briefly mentioned earlier, who's an expert on eagle populations in the West and has done work for the USGS. And I want to read what he said. He's the source of that line, the profoundly dangerous threat. So I just wanted to interject. So you're backtracking to the meeting in Carbon County. You met Mike Lockwood to talk about these other wildlife impacts. I just wanted to interject that, please.
Yeah. Well, and it was an Albany County meeting, but that doesn't matter.
Sure. Okay.
So I reached out to him and I chatted with him, and that gets to the very serious reality that he hadn't even paused because he's busy out in the field geotagging birds, and he's done so for 12 years because of a wrongly cited wind project that was awarded a $1 million payout that pays for his research, and he tracks golden eagles along the Front Range. So he's tracking them from New Mexico all the way up to Canada. And they overwinter in the Laramie Valley. This is their safe place. This is where they build nests and have babies. So
and you're talking about both golden eagles and bald eagles here. Is that right?
Correct.
So one of the things that jumped off the page when I read the Albany. Well, let me ask this question first. So Albany County Conservancy. Where does your funding come from?
You're looking at I run a 4th generation studio. So when I started the Conservancy, I was very upset about the one project I had received a letter from the Federal Energy Commission just because of where my homestead sits. I thought, how am I going to build my museum? This is right where the Overland and Cherokee Trails sit in the Laramie Valley, and that's where I want to put my museum. And I want to build a historic trail between Sherman and Tie Siding. So what is that? That's the highest point on the Transcontinental Railroad. Railroad historians from all over the world, Western history buffs, come to Albany County to see the Ames Monument, which is an iconic granite pyramid built in tribute to the Ames brothers. Which, when you look at the Credit Mobilier, I mean, that was just as corrupt as what we're dealing with today, with this kind of development. So, but I couldn't be quiet. I went to the public scoping meeting, like many people who put their toe in this because they know something is dissettling. And the more I educated, the more I realized that natural resources in the Laramie Valley are going to leave. When I talked to Mike, it became an extreme concern of mine because he said to me, you're looking at devastation, because he paused. He became quite depressed when he realized how many wind projects were going to build out in my county, because you're always jumping from one public comment period to the other. You don't really, there's no place you can go on the internet and say how many wind projects in Albany County. I mean, you have to look.
Sure. So, but I'm going to press you here. So Albany County Conservancy is a 501c3 nonprofit. And,
yes.
And so my question was so where does the funding come from? Well, you're the founder.
Well, so when I built the Conservancy, I was just going to public meetings to educate. I wasn't
Sure.
really making any comments. And like many people, it was dissettling to me because my local community wasn't reading the newspaper.
Right.
And it was COVID-19. So I'm a photographer. So I went out with a drone and a friend of mine, and I took pictures from the air. That's what gave me the perspective of an eagle's flight. Because I thought if people could understand where this sits without knowing biology, just to see it,
Right.
they would realize. So I posed a rhetorical question. I put up a billboard in my community, just right outside my studio's doorway on Highway 287, because that goes through the heart of downtown Laramie. And it had a photograph I'd taken with my friend, Dana Gage, and it had a tagline because I wanted to pose a rhetorical question. And it just simply said, "Why wind here?"
Okay. So, but well, I'm going to ask it
So
again.
people
Are
started to come to my studio and started leaving me grocery money. I'm in a very small community of 30,000. I'm home of the University of Wyoming.
right?
So retired professors. But the other thing that's key to
So,
this
so
is
just to be clear, so the Albany County Conservancy, you're depending on donations from people in Laramie and Albany County. That's who's funding the nonprofit, and you're the founder. And when did you create this entity?
I incorporated with the Secretary of State in 2019, and then I got nonprofit status in 2020.
Okay, got it. So I just wanted to be clear about that because one of the things, the charges, the claims that are made by the pro renewable crowd are these groups, they're putting up things on Facebook and they're funded by, the usual claims are the Exxon, Koch brothers. Are you getting any money from the oil and gas industry?
No,
Okay.
mine come from retired ecology professors who are in their 80s. And then I serve as the executive director completely for free, which has really drained my personal resources because I run a full-time portrait studio.
Sure.
So, and it's through my love of this area that I keep doing this. It's not acceptable to kill 28.2% according to US Fish and Wildlife, which I think the numbers are much larger because
but
they're playing
I want to make
games.
sure that okay, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I know I've done a lot of reporting and I've talked to many people like you, and we talked on the phone a few days ago. Many of them are women who look and sound like you, and I'm not saying this in any way that it's derogatory, that are doing these things, taking on these fights to protect their neighborhoods. And I'm interrupting. I told you before, I know you want to tell us everything, but I want to make sure I'm guiding you to explain exactly what you're talking about. So let's jump back to the issue of eagle kills, because this is the other, you mentioned the 28.2%. I want to go back to what your reference is here, because you know all about this, but the people who are listening don't. So that's why I'm just trying to slow you down a bit. Here's where in your attorney's comments to the Bureau of Land Management, you point out with respect to the phase 1, 2, 3 permits regarding, I believe you're talking about here, either the Two Rivers project, that issuance of the permit would mean that Fish and Wildlife Service has authorized 28.2% of the local area population, that is 14.8 bald eagles per year, to be killed, which does not include many sources of unpermitted eagle take. Well, this is a massive impact on the local population of bald eagles. We'll talk about golden eagles in a minute, because that to me is even more potentially more dire, because the golden eagle population is about 1/7 or 1/8 of the size of the bald eagle population. So golden eagles are far rarer than bald eagles. And you'd mentioned the golden eagles, but you're bringing up the eagle issue because this is one of the other areas where the Albany County Conservancy may sue the federal government, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, over these permits because of the potential violation of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Am I reading this back to you correctly?
Well, so it's very upsetting to members of my conservancy that the federal government isn't doing their homework correctly. it started with, it's very upsetting that these developers don't do their homework correctly. And that's because they hire consulting firms to go out and count animals to fill in the blanks of, say, an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, but they don't use the most recent data. In particular, when you look at rail-tie wind, they filled in the blanks with data that actually wasn't done by Quantum when ConnectGen hired an environmental consultant that exists right in Laramie, Wyoming. As you might expect, an environmental consultant in the Rockies would exist in Laramie. They were using data from 2006 from the original Shell Wind project that would sit in that area. So,
Right.
and they were using bat and bird studies in Oregon to talk about elk that they saw when they were counting bats. I mean, that's not a good source of data when you're filling in an environmental impact statement talking about, rail-tie wind in 2018, 2019, when they were collecting that data in
Sure.
2020.
But so just to get back to the focus here, which, and I understand that background and that's important, but the way I read your comments, the Conservancy's comments to the Bureau of Land Management is, in fact, you say right at the top, if the agencies refuse to cure the violations identified below, the Conservancy will seriously consider litigation to ensure that this project proceeds, if at all, only once the agencies have complied with all applicable laws. And what you're saying here, in your lawyer, William Eubanks out of Washington, is saying that the federal agencies involved, the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service, have not complied with federal law, more particularly, in particular, the National Environmental Policy Act and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, and that you are saying they need to do an entire environmental impact statement for all of these, the collective impact of all of these wind projects. Is that, am I reading this back correctly to you?
Well, the impact of all the projects, it's a much more basic task than you got it right at the beginning. When my kids go to public school and they don't do their assignment correct, their teacher uses red pen and she marks up their assignment or highlights it in, electronically and says, you need to go back and do this correctly. So you cannot do a 1,000-page environmental assessment. Anybody can go to the internet and look up how long should an environmental assessment be. An environmental assessment is defined as being 200 pages max.
Okay.
And the environmental assessment for Two Rivers is 990 pages. That's not okay.
So
That
why isn't longer better here? You've lost me.
They need to go to, correct, longer is better, but then they need to go to an environmental impact statement process and handle the whole process correctly. When we passed the National Environmental Protection Act, that was in the 70s.
Right.
Right? And we tasked it with 3 different tiers of environmental assessment. And an EA is not, it's not the correct level of environmental assessment, or they wouldn't be exceeding its length. They need to go back and do an environmental impact statement to follow the NEPA in the best spirit of the NEPA.
So, and if they did that, and I'm just assuming here, if that is in fact required, and so let's zoom forward here for just a minute, Ann, and I'm a quick station break. My guest is Ann Brande. She is based in Laramie, Wyoming. She's the founder of the Albany County Conservancy, and is, I think it would be fair to say, an ardent opponent of several wind projects that are proposed for southern and south central and southeastern Wyoming, including the Two Rivers project, the Chokecherry Sierra Madre project, Rock Creek, and rail-tie, which together would add something on the order of over 1,000 wind turbines in southern Wyoming. Is that
which is why I'm opposed? It's just like Altamont Pass, but we will be 10 times the size of Altamont Pass. And why is that key to identify? Altamont Pass has no bird population anymore. It also is high desert ecosystem. And it's been there for 30 years. So California's watched their wildlife be eradicated in that zone, right? And it's the same thing. Where you have one wind project, others will come.
And
Where you can make money building infrastructure, others tag on. And so because of the situation we're in with increased infrastructure, the infrastructure bill, and the possibility of credits, there's all this empowerment for all these projects are different developers. But when you're talking about cumulative impact, you're looking specifically at projects that all are on the same timeline, right?
That they would get built roughly in the next 3 years. But do they all hinge on? Because I wrote about this in my piece in Substack about the published a few days ago. A lot of this hinges on the construction of the Trans-West Express transmission line, right? That is the key offtake for these projects, including Chokecherry and Sierra Madre.
Well, Chokecherry, Sierra Madre, definitely, they are running their power to that. But when you look at rail tie wind, its power won't come from that. That's why it's in that wrongly sited area. The reason it exists is not because it's the most ideal area to exist. It's because it's inexpensive to the developer because it sits on a Western area power line that used to service the Craig Alt coal-fed power plant in northern Colorado. And that power line's been there since my grandfather.
Right.
You know.
So, but this is the key, though, right? As Lee Cordner, my friend who's been on the podcast before, he says there are three things you have to resolve when you're building any kind of energy infrastructure. Where are you going to put it? How are you going to connect it? And how are you going to pay for it? So, rail tie would be built, I guess, south of Laramie. Then is that what you're saying? Then, if I'm looking at the map here, trying to orient myself. So,
and if you look at it, you're seeing that it builds right off a tier of mountains that are part of the 14 mountain peaks of the Never Summer mountain range.
Gotcha.
So when you sit on Highway 287 there, just 8 miles east, you would have the I-80 corridor. Why is that important? Because it sits by Medicine Bow National Forest. It sits between Medicine Bow National Forest and Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado. So you have a large amount of wildlife that pass multiple times a year through that area. That's why it never really completed environmental impact statement with Shell, is they knew it was an environmental disaster. So it gets to now it's being dusted off and reintroduced with a new developer. It's still a terrible place to put it. It doesn't sit far from Hunton National Bird Refuge. When you look at Two Rivers Wind, which you've been discussing, it doesn't sit very far. Rock Creek actually sits closer. Rock Creek sits 5 miles from Bamforth National Wildlife Refuge. I mean, these are areas where turbines will sit are less than 1 mile from golden eagle nesting.
Right. So I hear you. Let me ask this question directly, Ann. And I know I can tell you're passionate about this, and I appreciate that. I'm also trying to make sure our listeners come along with you as we're going along. So let me just ask you this one question. I think you've answered it already, but I want to put it to you because what I hear in you is in the tone of your voice is outrage, right? And anger. And I think I'm identifying that. Are those the right words? But let me just ask it. Let me ask it directly. Why do you care so much?
I watched last week's 60 Minutes, and why I care so much is that biodiversity, we have killed off 60% of global biodiversity. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about wild animals. I'm not talking about a cow or your dog. I am talking about eagles and elk, moose, wolves. That's that is part of Wyoming. That's part of this section of the Rockies. Now, as we continue to develop, we have more people on the planet than we ever have. That is also threatening these populations. So the last thing you want to do is go into these pristine wilderness areas and build out next to them. And the last thing you want to hear is, that the BLM has decided to do a 200-page instead of, a 1,500-page assessment. The last thing you want to hear is that U.S. Fish and Wildlife don't know how to deal with the fact that they're at eagle threshold. They're changing the outline. If you read that document, they're changing the parameters of projects so that they can then, move the figures around, and they're not prepared. They need to reevaluate Eagle Tape.
So
that's what Mike's discussing.
Right. So you're saying, or I'm going to paraphrase back to you. What you're seeing, or what I think you're saying, is that these federal agencies are putting their thumb on the scale in favor of the wind projects instead of actually properly assessing the threat to wildlife. Is that? I mean, am I putting words in your mouth?
I think I want to encourage as many people as possible to voice their concerns in this process. I don't think intentionally, when employees of the BLM go to work, that they're intentionally doing this. But I do think the system needs to be, people need to be in the room. That's what the Conservancy is doing. I have eyes, I have ears. Members of my Conservancy do too. It's not okay not to do your homework correctly just because, a company is bearing down on you because they have a deadline.
So okay. Well, so fair enough. So if I were going to summarize, I like that what you just said, that they haven't, you're talking about the federal government, they haven't done their homework correctly. That's the issue, that they're going to have to be more punctilious, to use a long multisyllabic word.
I want to give them the olive branch and give them the opportunity to do it correctly.
And if they don't, you're going to sue.
You can't bend the rules just to get it off your desk.
So, but what would that cost? I mean, let's talk about that for a minute, because litigation is expensive, and I've followed some other cases like this where you are a David against a Goliath, both in the federal government and against some of these big corporate interests. Invenergy is a very large company, very owned by Michael Polsky. He's a billionaire. Two Rivers is owned by, or the project is being pushed by Blue Earth Renewables, a company based in Calgary. These are deep pocketed interests on the other side. So if you go to court, it's gonna be expensive. No, how would you make that work?
Well, so that is something too that many people have said the same thing, and so that keeps them quiet.
That they're intimidated?
I think they check out. They don't invest the attention span that they should. And it's because it is a David and Goliath, but it's not. It's not. So for one thing, I'm a nonprofit. I'm not an individual.
Right.
And I'm not a corporation, and I don't have corporate sponsors. For another, my legal representation is a nonprofit law firm that specializes in this, and they're focused on wildlife and historic sites. So it's a different situation. It requires a lot of my time. I have now had to become familiar with federal processes, and I have some very smart people, because I'm in a university town, who are retired, who are passionate about the NEPA, who've been able to explain to me, for example, what Section 106 laws are. That's historic sites, cultural sites. And that's dear to my heart because of my museum. But I just read Crazy Horse by Marie Sandos. It's a phenomenal book. She was able to interview He Dog. That was Crazy Horse's brother, not by family lineage just by friendship. And she writes as close to a native language as she can when she's writing that history. And in that book, it says that history is like wind on buffalo grass, and that a society has to know where they've come from to know where they're going. I am I can't prevent development. I use energy just like everyone else. But it is not right just because one company is making money from a piece of the pie that then I get 20 in the same area. We need biodiversity. We need wildlife. We need to manage this. We need to have a conversation. And I'm not going to cower because somebody has decided, oh, it's bigger than us. It's not bigger than us. We are bigger than it. I want my children to know what a mule deer looks like. Mule deer in Wyoming have the longest migration routes in the world. Why? We're arid. They travel hundreds of miles to eat. I don't want them to travel hundreds of miles in wind turbines. There's a study out from central Wyoming that was completed in 2018 that states a mule deer will not bring her young through an area of wind development. Well, I can agree with that. I don't think I would do that either. But once that has occurred, that migration route has been lost. It doesn't matter if in 30 years they decommission that project.
So let me interrupt you here. So I'm going to remind people who are listening, if you want to follow up on this, and the Albany County Conservancy's comments to the Bureau of Land Management, you can find it online, eplanning.blm.gov/eplanning -UI project /2003-881/570. I know that's I'll put it in the show notes on YouTube because Mike Lockwood's comments are there as well. I want to read this though, and I want to ask about, I asked you about what motivates you, but I want to read what Mike Lockwood, the wildlife biologist we've mentioned before, and I cited his work in my piece on Substack about this. He's talking about golden eagles here, and I'll just read this. Wind turbines are a profoundly dangerous additive human threat to golden eagles on Wyoming landscapes. For unknown reasons, golden eagles are especially vulnerable to turbine collisions, and until somewhat recently, large-scale wind projects were not part of Wyoming's energy infrastructure. Existing wind development is undoubtedly now killing significant numbers of golden eagles in Wyoming, but the rapid expansion and massive footprint of proposed new projects will exponentially impact golden eagles. I mean, it seems like, the way it's a powerfully written paragraph. And the key here is in your comments, the Albany County Conservancy's comments to the BLM, pointing out the potential eagle take here, which would have to be permitted by the federal government. And your lawyer writes, given that the developer cannot avoid committing repeated violations of federal law in the absence of Walden Golden Eagle Protection Act permits, we would argue that it is likely, indeed virtually certain, that the developer would not proceed with constructing a project that will be routinely mired in enforcement proceedings and subject to millions of dollars in civil or criminal penalties. I bring this up because it was just last April, that NextEra Energy was prosecuted by the Department of Justice after they knowingly, purposely put their wind project in the middle of known golden eagle habitat. And I would argue that company did so because they thought, well, if we get penalized, the fines are going to be less than the tax credits that we're getting. And I'm as cynical as the next person. I believe in Lily Tomlin's line, no matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up. But it just seems like in this case, again, the wind developers and even the federal government, it appears, are willing to say, well, we'll sacrifice a few eagles because climate change, because we want more renewables. Is it that stark of a trade-off here, that the idea of renewable energy is so popular that wildlife was going to be sacrificed as necessarily as part of this trade-off?
So it's extremely alarming to my members that mindset prevails. Because making money is making money. We know that wind and solar are only a portion of energy. We know that we also need other sources. We know the wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day. We know the sun isn't up 24 hours a day. You're going to have other sources of energy too. You have to have a table with legs. You can't just have one leg. It won't stand firmly. Bad development is bad development. You place a power line in the wrong place, you build industrially in the wrong location, and it's just bad for everyone. We've seen that in other instances. Wind is not new to the table with that, and these companies aren't just focused on renewable. Many of them are just energy companies that have decided to then have a renewable focus as part of an investment group. They're not solely renewable.
Right.
Some of them are, and some of them aren't.
Well, so this is the other part of the letter to the BLM that I think, or the comments. It's one of your concluding statements in the comments here, and it says, for all of these reasons, the Fish and Wildlife Service's evaluation of issuing 2 Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act permits for this project is arbitrary, capricious, and in violation of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and their implementing regulations. So if you're going to go to court, this seems like those are going to be the federal laws that you're litigating around. But I want to ask you this, because we talked on the phone the other day, and it was something I mentioned that I'm sympathetic to what you're doing. But the question I put to you was, why is it always women? And it's not always women, but it is women who are leading the charge against, as I've seen it, and I've done dozens of these interviews with people in Madison County, Iowa, in New Hampshire, in Vermont, and across the country. It's usually women who are about your age who are leading the charge on this. Why is that?
In my profession, and that's all I can go back to. Okay, I love people, so I'm not cynical yet. I'm a portrait photographer. Yes, I photograph nature because I love it, but that's not how I earn my living. I love people, and I love photographing them where they're happiest. And that happens to be in nature where I am. When I ask them, where do you want me to take your family portrait? They're taking me to Medicine Bow National Forest. It's their space. So I look at this, and why you have women, my clients are women. I get occasionally a man who's usually asked by a woman. A wife will ask a husband. Women, we are passionate about protecting our young, having them have quality of life. Now, men are great fathers, single parents, don't get me wrong, but when you look at wrongful death lawsuits and travesty in a family, when you look at advocacy, how many times is it a woman that's pushing, even out of pain, that everything for a purpose, I'm going to make sure that fentanyl doesn't ruin your family. Well, I'm going to make sure that we don't lose biodiversity, because what happens when we do? On the 60 Minutes show, we learned, right? You have scientists from Stanford, from all sorts of different universities that have been publishing books since the 70s saying, when we lose biodiversity, that cyclically, we will cease to exist as a civilization. There'll be a renewal period, just like the Ice Age. That was the last time this happened. We can't just keep developing open space. And where this started is in 2019, as the world started to shut down because of COVID, everybody was discovering, I watched Planet Earth. I watched the gentleman who's been doing that his whole life, the journalist, and he had come out with a movie called My Last Will and Testament. And David Attenborough, and he talked about, in the 70s, we were at about 50% green space left on the planet, and it's been diminishing. right? And I think it was 70%. I'd have to go back, but that resonated with me because I was sitting there because I live in one of those green spaces, and that's by choice. I choose to live. My homestead sits right across from pretty much Rocky Mountain National Park if you could fly like an eagle, if you didn't have to take highways to get there. And there are 14 mountain peaks that I look at. Steamboat, Colorado is really only about 8 to 10 miles west of the area that I sit in, which gets to it's an ecosystem. Well, if I build out with 8 or 9 wind projects, that's their wildlife population too.
So, well, I appreciate how you talked about that. What would you say then? Okay, one of the questions I've written down here. What do you say to people who live in cities? And because when you look at polling data, right, the wind energy and solar are very popular. 70, 80%. Solar in particular, very popular when in Gallup polls. You live in a relatively small city, right? Laramie, you said 30,000, and
But I'm 2 hours from Denver, Colorado. That's what people need to understand. And that's why I'm important. I go to Denver to go shopping. I travel. My husband is from Oslo, Norway. I met him at the University of Wyoming. I just happen to be one of those folks that like to go to the city for a week max. And then
right.
I like to come back to my mountains. But, those people in the city, did you take your children to Yellowstone? Do you want to drive through industrial development and know for a fact that you saw one bird in the entire 14 days that you were in Wyoming? Do you want to know that because when you get rid of biodiversity, you're also altering the landscape. How are you going to propagate the soil? How are you going to fertilize the soil? I mean, you're messing with the balance of seasons. Many things are being altered. And as our planet keeps heating up, wind development is not going to solve that if you don't have any biodiversity left, if you don't have any green space. It's all a whole. It's not just pieces of the pie. So I would like to have a quick magic bullet for society. And I think that's the comfort of wind or comfort of solar, right? It's going to solve everything, but it doesn't. I'm the mom who brings cloth shopping bags to the store, and every bottle I bought with plastic had to have a triangle on it. And what's the irony of that? We know that triangle was marketing from the plastics industry to make me think it would be recycled. But not all of it was recycled, was it? But I meticulously saved all of it till I read an article, right? But you don't put wrongly cited industrial development up. You need to keep green space. You need to keep habitat intact. And at this rapid decline, do we really want to do this in this area?
So what would you say to then? I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. I'll put my cards on the table. So if you were the energy czar, what would you say is the way forward then? If you're obviously critical of these wind projects in these locations, what's the way forward if you had to pick how we're going to provide the energy and power we need for the modern economy?
Well, Wyoming's having that conversation right now. We wish that we could put the Natrium nuclear plant up as soon as possible, but now you have the problem of getting the structure built and also getting the uranium that you need, which is ironic because Wyoming has uranium, but not the uranium that they use. I'm not against energy. I'm using Zoom with you today. I am against, we keep consuming more and more and more. Now we're growing. Humanity is growing. So of course we're going to consume more, but that's a whole nother conversation. We're consuming vast quantities of everything, and we need to slow down. Just because I drive an electric car doesn't mean I can, consume more. Or if I have a hybrid, it doesn't mean that I need to travel more or drive more. I mean, we continue to exceed limits.
Okay.
Right.
So let's shift here, and I think we've covered this pretty well, Anne, and we're coming not quite to an hour yet, but I think you've stated your case pretty well, and I want to direct people to the Albany County Conservancy, and I'll give that information in just a minute. But I want to wrap up because I think you've presented a compelling case and major arguments for why you're opposing these many different wind projects in southern Wyoming. So I'll ask you the questions I ask all of my guests who come on the podcast. What are you reading? What books are at the top of your mentioned Crazy Horse? What books are at the top of your book pile these days?
So when I heard about rail-tie wind, I went back and finally slowed down and I read Green Grass of Wyoming and I read My Friend Flicka. Why? My Friend Flicka is what opened up Wyoming tourism. I mean,
I don't know that book. What is that book? I'm sorry.
My Friend Flicka. It's about a boy and a horse. It was written in the late 30s, early 40s.
Oh, okay.
It's been made into 4 Hollywood movies.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's right where rail-tie will sit.
And rail-tie would be north of Laramie. I'm looking at the map here. Just if
South.
you don't, south, straight south of Laramie, close to the Buttes, then, or off of 287.
Yeah, it would sit between the Buttes and 12 miles most from the northern Colorado state line.
I gotcha. Okay.
And that, by the way, is the oldest section of Wyoming territory. The oldest ranch in Wyoming sits right in the middle of that project. It's called the Double X.
Gotcha. And
go
ahead.
So
Sorry.
that book made me realize that, back in the 30s and 40s, society did grasp wildlife. I mean, the number one read, that book's been translated into 6 languages. I used to have Japanese tourists stand outside my historic portrait studio and take pictures because they had read My Friend Flicka in Japanese.
Huh. Wow.
So I went back and slowed down and read it.
Gotcha.
But it gets to how people understood wildlife migration in the Rockies at that time. But now we think the deer in our front yard lives in our front yard. That's not the case.
Got it.
That deer travels up to, 500 miles or more.
Sure.
Yeah.
So my last question, and what gives you hope?
Oh my gosh, my children, my beautiful sunrises and sunsets. The fact that with all the snow we've gotten this winter in the Laramie Valley, we sit at 100% of our snowpack, which means we aren't in drought. We were supposed to not be existing. We were supposed to have no biodiversity by now. I mean, they were predicting, some of the books that were mentioned in that 60 Minutes show, that we would be hitting this point in the mid 70s. Well, we didn't, did we? We're humans, we're resilient, we can adapt, which is why it's not okay to just turn over this conversation to companies who have intent of a bottom line. I would like to see more innovation. Design a wind turbine that doesn't kill. Don't just make them bigger and taller. Part of the concern about wind development in this area, with there's 8 or 9 projects, is they're maritime. We're looking at turbines the height of the Eiffel Tower when you look at Rock Creek. You bet that's going to strike eagles. I don't know how you wouldn't strike an eagle with that. I would like to see more innovation. I would like to see people have a conversation with anyone that they can to educate. They're in a small community. There are so many people in my community. There are ranchers who are fearful. They may have been contacted to be a leasee and told all their neighbors had signed on. Wyoming's a checkerboard. So honestly, if you look at these projects, very few ranchers were leasees because a portion of the project would sit on county, state, and federal land. That's what's empowering this.
Right.
The more we talk about it, the stronger we become.
Well, I like
bad
that.
developments, bad development, good developments, good development. How are we going to know one from the other if we just sign off our destiny to someone else?
Well, I like that. The more we talk about it, the stronger we become, and I think that's a good place to to draw this to an end, Anne. My guest has been Anne Brande. She is the founder of the Albany County Conservancy. That's Albany, Wyoming County, not New York. She is based in Laramie, Wyoming. She is a photographer and a passionate advocate for biodiversity, as we have just learned over the past 55 minutes or so. You can find out more about her at the albanycountyconservancy.org online. And thank you for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And to all you in podcast land, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry podcast. If you're so inclined, leave us a positive review on your local podcast outlet, or follow us on YouTube. RobertBryce.tv is on YouTube. You can find all the podcasts there as well. So until the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast, see ya.